They say a daughter is a mother's reflection, a softened mirror of the woman who gave her life. But sometimes, in the quiet, manicured suburbs of Aurora, Colorado, that mirror doesn't just crack. It shatters into 1,000 jagged pieces. We are instinctively drawn to the faces of evil, but we are captivated when those faces are young, delicate, and hauntingly beautiful. In the digital age, a single look can turn a perpetrator into a cult icon. A playful tilt of the head, a coy smirk directed at a news camera, a girl casually fixing her hair in a courtroom as if she were prepping for a prom photo, while the blood of her own mother was barely dry on the bathroom floor. It was the smile that conquered TikTok, but behind the pixels lies a story of 79 wounds and a scream that went unanswered. This is the chilling reality of Isabella Guzman, the girl who proved that the most dangerous weapon isn't a knife. It's the mask of innocence. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in the summer of 2013, one must first look past the viral courtroom clips and the haunting, playful expressions of an 18-year-old girl. We must look into the quiet corners of a life that, on the surface, mirrored the American dream of many immigrant families. Isabella Guzman was not born a monster. She was a girl born into the expectation of normalcy, raised in a world where the boundaries between teenage rebellion and psychological collapse were dangerously blurred. Isabella grew up in the suburbs of Aurora, Colorado, a place defined by its vast rolling plains and the quiet safety of its residential streets. Her mother, Yoon Hoi, had come from South Korea, seeking the stability and opportunity that the United States promised. Yoon was a woman of discipline, a woman who understood the value of hard work and the importance of family structure. She was, by all accounts, a devoted mother, perhaps protective to a fault, but driven by a deep-seated love for her only daughter. In the early years, the bond between mother and daughter seemed unbreakable. Photos from Isabella's childhood show a bright-eyed girl with a wide, genuine smile, long before that smile became a source of international fascination. She was the light of Yoonmi's life. Neighbors remembered a polite girl, a student who moved through the world with a certain grace. There was no outward sign of the darkness that would later consume her. No history of cruelty to animals, no pyromania, none of the traditional red flags that criminologists often look for in the histories of violent offenders. But as Isabella entered her teenage years, the mask of the dutiful daughter began to slip. It started subtly, small fissures in the foundation of their relationship. The transition from childhood to adolescence is often a battlefield, but in the Guzman Hoi household, the skirmishes were becoming increasingly volatile. Isabella was becoming a young woman, and with that growth came a fierce, almost desperate desire for autonomy, a desire that frequently clashed with Yoonmi's more traditional, structured parenting style. By 18, Isabella was a striking young woman. She possessed a delicate, almost doll-like beauty that commanded attention. But behind those dark eyes, a transformation was taking place. The ordinary girl was being replaced by someone unpredictable, someone who viewed the world through a lens of perceived persecution. The typical grievances of a teenager, curfews, chores, the choice of friends, were no longer just points of contention. They were becoming triggers for an explosive internal rage. Those who knew her in high school described a girl who could be charming and magnetic one moment, and cold and distant the next. She was a girl of moods, shadows that would pass over her face like storm clouds on a summer afternoon. Yet, in the social hierarchy of suburban Colorado, she remained relatively unremarkable to the outside world. She wasn't the outcast. She wasn't the troubled kid in the back of the class. She was simply Isabella, the girl next door who seemed to be going through a particularly difficult rebellious phase. However, inside the walls of the family home on South Lima Street, the atmosphere was thickening with a palpable sense of dread. The domestic warmth was being replaced by an icy, suffocating tension. Isabella's stepfather, Ryan Hoy, began to notice a shift that went beyond teenage angst. There was a coldness in Isabella's gaze, a way she would look at her mother that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't the look of a frustrated child. It was the look of a stranger watching an enemy. The psychology of a female perpetrator often involves a period of simmering, a long, slow burn of resentment that remains hidden from the public eye. Isabella was perfecting the art of the dual identity. To her peers, she was just another girl on the cusp of adulthood. To her mother, she was becoming a source of constant, low-level anxiety. Yunmi, ever the caregiver, tried to bridge the gap. She tried to enforce rules not out of a desire for control, but out of a desperate hope to steer her daughter back toward the right path. She didn't realize that every rule she enforced was being logged in Isabella's mind as a personal affront, a brick in the wall of a silent, growing vendetta. The dream of a stable, happy life in Aurora was evaporating. Isabella began to withdraw further into her own world, a world where her mother was no longer a provider, but an obstacle. The ordinary woman image was a thinning veil. As she walked the halls of her school or navigated the aisles of local shops, no one could have guessed that this 18-year-old was standing on the precipice of a mental and moral abyss. There were no sirens, no warning lights. There was only the quiet ticking of a clock in a suburban kitchen and a young woman who was beginning to see blood where others saw love. By the late summer of 2013, the transformation was nearly complete. The girl who once played with dolls was now obsessed with the power she could exert over those who wronged her. The motive wasn't money, and it wasn't a sudden burst of passion. It was the cold, calculated conclusion of a mind that had decided the person who gave her life was the only thing standing in the way of her freedom. The still waters of Isabella Guzman's personality were about to reveal the monsters lurking beneath the surface, and the town of Aurora would never look at a teenage smile the same way again. The architecture of a family is often built on unspoken agreements, but by August 2013, the foundation of the Hoy household was crumbling into dust. To understand why an 18-year-old girl would turn a blade upon the woman who birthed her, we must examine the cracks in their bond, cracks that were widening into chasms. This wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of the maternal connection. In the realm of female criminality, the home is frequently the primary theater of war, and for Isabella Guzman, her mother, Yunmi, had become the ultimate adversary. The relationship between Yunmi and Isabella had devolved into a toxic cycle of surveillance and defiance. Yunmi, perhaps sensing a darkness she couldn't quite name, attempted to tighten her grip. She worried about the company Isabella kept, the late hours, and the growing lack of respect that radiated from her daughter like a physical heat. But in the mind of a girl spiraling into a fractured reality, this motherly concern was interpreted as a declaration of war. Isabella didn't see a mother trying to save her. She saw a jailer. It is here that the psychological profile of the Black Widow, or the femme fatale, takes a different, more domestic shape. Isabella wasn't seeking financial gain or a lover's approval. Her motive was rooted in a distorted sense of entitlement and a deep-seated rejection of authority. She began to exhibit a chilling lack of empathy, a hallmark of those who hide aggression behind a facade of youth and fragility. While she appeared to be a delicate teenager to the world at home, she was becoming a predator in a sundress. The tension reached a boiling point in the days leading up to the tragedy. The arguments were no longer about messy rooms or missed curfews. They were visceral, screaming matches that left the house trembling. It was during one of these confrontations that Isabella took a step that shifted the narrative from domestic strife to premeditated intent. She didn't just scream, she documented her rage. She sent an email to her mother, a digital omen that would later haunt the investigators. The words were short, punchy, and devoid of any daughterly affection. "You will pay." Those 3 words transformed a family dispute into a countdown. Yunmi was terrified. For the first time, the mother who had always tried to fix things realized she was in danger. She did what any terrified parent would do. She reached out for help. She called the police, not to have her daughter arrested, but to have her cautioned. She hoped that a badge and a uniform might snap Isabella back into reality. When the officers arrived at the South Lima Street home, they found a young woman who was eerily calm. Isabella looked the officers in the eye, her voice steady, her demeanor that of a misunderstood victim. The officers, seeing no immediate signs of physical violence, could do little more than offer words of advice. They left, unaware that they had just witnessed a masterclass in manipulation. Isabella's stepfather, Ryan Hoy, was the silent witness to this escalating madness. He saw the way Isabella would stare at the back of her mother's head, a cold, unblinking gaze that suggested she was measuring a distance or calculating a strike. He tried to intervene, to act as a buffer between the 2 women, but he was increasingly sidelined. The bond between Isabella and Yunmi had become a closed circuit of resentment, and Ryan was merely a spectator to the flickering lights of their dying relationship. The plan wasn't born from a single moment of clarity. It grew like a parasite. Isabella began to obsess over the perceived wrongs her mother had committed. In her mind, Yunmi was the source of all her frustrations, the barrier to a life of absolute freedom. Whether this was fueled by a burgeoning mental illness or a calculated cold-blooded decision to eliminate an obstacle remains a point of intense debate. What is clear, however, is that Isabella began to distance herself from the role of the daughter. She was no longer Isabella. She was an agent of retribution. On the afternoon of August 28, 2013, a strange incident occurred that served as a final warning. While Yunmi was at work, Isabella allegedly spat in her mother's face during a brief encounter. It was an act of supreme disrespect, a physical manifestation of the "you will pay" promise. Later that day, Yunmi's fear had become so acute that she called her ex-husband, Isabella's biological father, Robert Guzman. She begged him to talk to their daughter, to calm the storm that seemed to be brewing behind Isabella's eyes. Robert came over. He sat with Isabella on the back porch, the Colorado sun setting over the suburban fence. He spoke to her about respect, about the love a mother has for her child, and for a moment, he thought he had reached her. Isabella listened. She nodded. She played the part of the repentant teenager to perfection. He left that evening believing the crisis had been averted. He believed that the mask was the true face. But as the front door clicked shut and the house grew quiet, the air inside 2624 South Lima Street didn't feel lighter. It felt charged. The domestic warmth that Yunmi had worked so hard to maintain was now a suffocating shroud. The cracks were no longer just visible. The entire structure was leaning. Inside her bedroom, Isabella wasn't thinking about her father's advice or her mother's love. She was listening to the sounds of her mother returning home from work, the sound of the shower being turned on, the mundane noises of a woman who thought the danger had passed. Isabella wasn't a child anymore. She wasn't a victim of her circumstances. She was a woman who had weighed the life of her mother against her own temporary frustrations and found the life wanting. The Black Widow typically kills for insurance money. The femme fatale kills for passion. Isabella Guzman was something more modern and perhaps more terrifying. She was a killer who acted out of a cold, narcissistic need to delete anyone who challenged her will. The ordinary girl was gone. In her place stood someone who had already decided that tonight, the debt would be settled in full. The evening of August 28, 2013, began with the deceptive rhythm of a typical suburban Wednesday. In Aurora, the air was cooling as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, casting long, bruised shadows across South Lima Street. Inside house number 2624, the mundane sounds of domesticity played out. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of a television, the heavy footsteps of a man trying to find peace in a home filled with invisible landmines. Ryan Hoy sat downstairs, perhaps allowing himself a moment of cautious optimism. His stepdaughter had spoken with her biological father. The "you will pay" email was, he hoped, just the hysterical hyperbole of a troubled teen. But in the silence of the upper floor, Isabella Guzman was preparing to prove that her words were not a threat. They were a prophecy. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Yunmi Hoy returned home from a long shift. She was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from carrying the weight of a fractured family. She exchanged a few words with Ryan, nothing memorable, just the low-stakes chatter of a weary couple. She then headed upstairs. She wanted nothing more than the cleansing heat of a shower to wash away the stress of the day and the lingering dread of her daughter's recent outbursts. She entered the bathroom, closed the door, and turned on the water. Downstairs, Ryan heard the pipes groan, a familiar, comforting sound. But then, the rhythm of the house was shattered. It started with a thud, then a muffled cry. Ryan's heart hammered against his ribs as the sounds escalated into a frantic, wet drumming against the bathroom floor. He sprinted up the stairs, his lungs burning. He reached the bathroom door and turned the knob. It was locked. From inside, the sound of the shower continued to hiss, a rhythmic backdrop to a scene of mounting carnage. He pounded on the wood, his voice cracking as he screamed Yunmi's name. "Isabella! Open the door! Let me in!" There was no verbal response. Instead, he saw a dark, viscous liquid beginning to seep from under the doorframe, staining the hallway carpet. It was blood. It moved with a terrifying speed, a silent tide of red. Ryan threw his shoulder against the door, once, twice. The wood groaned, but the lock held. Through the narrow gap beneath the door, he caught a glimpse of Isabella's feet. She was standing still. Inside that small, steam-filled room, the ordinary girl had vanished, replaced by a whirlwind of clinical, repetitive violence. Isabella didn't just strike. She decimated. She had armed herself with a knife, and as her mother stood vulnerable and naked in the shower, Isabella had lunged. The first strike was likely a shock, a sharp, cold intrusion into the warmth of the water. But it was followed by another, and another. The autopsy would later tell the gruesome story that Ryan could only hear through the door. Isabella was not merely killing, she was erasing. She targeted her mother's face and neck with a terrifying, obsessive precision. 31 stab wounds to the face, 7 to the neck. The rest were scattered across Yunmi's torso and arms as she desperately tried to shield herself from her own child. The sounds Ryan heard were the sounds of a struggle for life that was being systematically extinguished. Ryan ran to the phone, his fingers slick with sweat as he dialed 911. His voice, captured on the emergency recording, is a portrait of pure, unadulterated panic. He told the dispatcher his daughter was killing his wife. He begged for help. He returned to the door, desperate, and this time, the door finally opened. The steam billowed out into the hallway, carrying with it the metallic tang of blood and the scent of cheap soap. Isabella stepped out. She didn't look like a girl who had just committed a crime of passion. She didn't look panicked. She looked transformed. She was draped in a cloak of icy detachment. In her hand, she held the knife. She didn't say a word to Ryan. She didn't scream. She simply walked past him, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance that only she could see. Ryan rushed into the bathroom, but the sight that greeted him was beyond the capacity of the human mind to process. Yunmi was slumped against the wall of the tub, the water still running, turning the pool at her feet into a pale pink swirl. Her face, the face that had looked at Isabella with love for 18 years, was unrecognizable. The sheer volume of the wounds suggested a ritualistic level of rage. It wasn't an act of murder, it was an act of mutilation. While Ryan desperately tried to find a pulse that wasn't there, Isabella was moving through the house with a chilling, mechanical efficiency. She didn't flee immediately. She went to her room. She changed her clothes. She washed the worst of the gore from her skin, though the scent of it likely clung to her hair. She was a black widow who had finished her web, and now it was time to leave the carcass behind. She slipped out of the house into the cool Colorado night. As the first sirens began to wail in the distance, the sound Yunmi had hoped would save her just hours earlier, Isabella disappeared into the shadows of the suburban streets. She left behind a husband shattered, a home turned into a slaughterhouse, and a mother who had paid the ultimate price for a daughter's perceived grievances. The sensory details of that night are what haunt the investigators to this day. The sound of the water running for minutes after the heart had stopped. The sight of the "you will pay" email still sitting in an inbox downstairs. And the image of Isabella walking out of that bathroom with the calm of a person who had just finished a mundane chore. In the world of true crime, we often look for the why. We look for the breaking point. But as the clock struck 10 p.m. in Aurora, there was no why that could satisfy the horror. There was only the how. 79 thrusts of a blade, a locked door, and a daughter who had decided that her mother's life was a debt that could only be settled in blood. The still waters had finally overflowed, and the resulting flood had washed away everything that Isabella Guzman used to be. She was no longer a student, a daughter, or a neighbor. She was a fugitive, wandering through the night with the blood of her mother metaphorically and literally under her fingernails. The hunt was on. But even as the police swarmed South Lima Street, they had no idea that the girl they were looking for wasn't hiding in fear. She was preparing for her next act, the act that would eventually make her the most infamous face on the internet. The day X of the murder was over, but the day X of Isabella's public persona was just beginning. The aftermath of a storm is often quieter than the gale itself, and in the wake of the carnage on South Lima Street, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the neighborhood. As the blue and red lights of the Aurora Police Department pulsed against the siding of the Hoy residence, the primary question wasn't just why, but where. Isabella Guzman had stepped out of that blood-slicked bathroom and vanished into the Colorado night, leaving behind a trail of crimson footprints that stopped abruptly at the edge of the property. She had no car, no money, and no clear destination, yet she had slipped away with the grace of a phantom. The manhunt began in earnest before the clock struck midnight. Officers fanned out across the suburban grid, their flashlights cutting through the darkness of parks and backyards. They were looking for an 18-year-old girl in a pink sports bra and turquoise shorts, the outfit Ryan Hoy had described through his tears. But Isabella was already ahead of them. In the mind of a predator, the first few hours after a strike are defined by a singular, primal drive: survival. She didn't head for the highways or the bus stations. She stayed close, moving through the shadows of a world she had known her entire life, now seeing it through the eyes of a killer. For 15 hours, Isabella Guzman was the most wanted woman in Colorado. The police issued a critical alert, describing her as armed and extremely dangerous. The community was on edge. Neighbors locked their doors and peered through their blinds, terrified that the doll-faced girl from down the street might be crouching in their crawl spaces. There was a surreal quality to the search. This wasn't a hardened convict or a career criminal. This was a girl who, just days prior, was likely scrolling through social media like any other teenager. The contrast between her delicate appearance and the sheer brutality of the 79 stab wounds created a sense of cognitive dissonance that the public struggled to process. While the police searched, the first suspicions began to solidify into a terrifying profile. Detectives interviewed Ryan Hoy and Isabella's biological father, Robert. The pieces of the puzzle started to click into place. The "you will pay" email, the spitting incident, the volatile mood swings. This wasn't a girl who had snapped in a moment of temporary insanity. This was a crescendo. The mask of the ordinary daughter had been discarded in that bathroom, and what remained was something cold and unrecognizable. Then came the first sighting. Early the next afternoon, a report came in from a nearby parking garage on South Parker Road, less than a mile from the crime scene. A witness had spotted a young woman who looked remarkably like the girl on the news. She was sitting in a car that didn't belong to her hair matted, her expression blank. When the police arrived, they found Isabella. She wasn't running. She wasn't fighting. She was simply there. The capture was almost anticlimactic. As officers approached with weapons drawn, Isabella didn't reach for a knife or scream for mercy. She moved with a strange, liquid lethality, slow and deliberate. She was taken into custody without incident, but the girl who entered the back of the patrol car was not the same girl who had been lived in that house for years. She was a hollowed-out version of herself, or perhaps, for the first time, she was her true self. At the station, the mask of the innocent girl attempted a final, desperate performance. In those initial hours of interrogation, there was no confession. There were no tears for Yunmi. Instead, there was a chilling disconnect. Isabella acted as though she were a spectator to her own life. When investigators presented her with the reality of what had happened, the state of the bathroom, the number of wounds, the testimony of her stepfather, she didn't recoil in horror. She watched them with a curiosity that was deeply unsettling. The first suspicions of the detectives were that they were dealing with a sociopath, a black widow in the making who had simply skipped the marriage phase and gone straight to matricide. But as the hours turned into days, a different theory began to emerge. Isabella's behavior wasn't just cold, it was bizarre. She would stare at the walls for hours, then suddenly break into a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. She would fix her hair in the reflection of the interrogation room glass, preening as if she were waiting for a stage cue rather than a murder charge. The public, however, saw something different. When the first mugshot was released, the world was introduced to a girl who looked more like a catalog model than a murderer. Her features were symmetrical, her skin clear, her gaze intense. The fragility that the deadly woman archetype often uses to hide aggression was on full display. People began to wonder, how could something so beautiful do something so hideous? It was during this period of initial detention that the first seeds of her viral fame were planted. Isabella wasn't just a suspect, she was a visual enigma. She began to play to the audience of guards and lawyers, honing the facial expressions that would later captivate millions. The grief of a daughter who had lost her mother was entirely absent, replaced by a performative, eerie vanity. She seemed more concerned with how she appeared to the camera than the fact that she was facing a life sentence. The search efforts were over, and the investigation was shifting from who to what. What was Isabella Guzman? Was she a cold-blooded killer who had meticulously planned the removal of her mother? Or was she a broken vessel, a girl whose mind had shattered under the weight of a burgeoning psychosis? As the detectives built their case, the shadow of the "you will pay" email loomed large. It suggested premeditation, a cold calculation that clashed with the image of a confused, mentally ill teenager. The town of Aurora tried to return to normal, but the air remained thick with the memory of that night. The still waters had broken, and the girl who had conquered the digital world with a smile was now locked behind steel bars, waiting for her day in court. The mask was being polished, the world was watching, and Isabella Guzman was ready for her close-up. The wheels of American justice are often slow, but in the case of Isabella Guzman, they were grinding against a psychological enigma that the state of Colorado was ill-prepared to handle. As the 18-year-old sat in a stark jail cell, a team of forensic experts and detectives began the painstaking process of dismantling her life, looking for the exposure that would explain the inexplicable. They weren't just looking for physical evidence. They were looking for the moment the ordinary girl became the Black Widow of her own household. The physical evidence was, quite frankly, overwhelming. The bathroom on South Lima Street was a forensic nightmare. Detectives recovered the murder weapon, a kitchen knife that had been used with such ferocity that the blade was nearly exhausted by the end of the assault. Blood spatter analysis told a harrowing story of a struggle that moved from the shower to the floor, confirming that Yunmi Hoi had fought for every breath. There was no question of who had held the knife. Isabella's DNA was intermingled with her mother's in a visceral biological bond that no defense lawyer could argue away. But the investigation soon pivoted from the how to the state of mind. This is where the case began to veer into the surreal. As detectives combed through Isabella's digital footprint, the "you will pay" email stood out like a red flare in a dark sky. To the prosecution, this was the smoking gun of premeditation. It wasn't an impulse, it wasn't a sudden break. It was a threat, followed by execution. They saw a cold, calculating young woman who had grown tired of her mother's rules and decided to delete the problem. However, as psychologists began their court-ordered evaluations, the portrait of Isabella started to fracture. The exposure wasn't just about a crime. It was about a mind in total collapse. Doctors observed her in her cell. She wasn't acting like a typical inmate facing a life sentence. She was seen staring into corners, talking to people who wasn't there, and exhibiting a flat affect, a psychological term for a total lack of emotional resonance. She didn't seem to understand that her mother was dead, or if she did, the information carried the same weight as a weather report. The overconfidence that often leads to a criminal's exposure was present in Isabella, but it was tinted with a strange, manic hue. She seemed to believe she was untouchable, not because she was a master criminal, but because she was no longer living in the same reality as the rest of society. The detectives discovered that in the weeks leading up to the murder, Isabella's behavior had become increasingly erratic. She told friends she was hearing voices. She claimed her mother wasn't actually her mother, but an imposter, a symptom known in clinical circles as Capgras delusion. Isabella's alibi, or lack thereof, crumbled not because she was sloppy, but because she seemed to have forgotten she needed one. She had walked out of the house, left the weapon, and simply waited in a parking garage. To a seasoned detective, this was either the sign of a genius-level sociopath who knew she would be caught and didn't care, or a girl who was profoundly elsewhere. The overconfidence wasn't rooted in a belief that she wouldn't be caught. It was rooted in the belief that the rules of the world no longer applied to her. The exposure reached a fever pitch when the results of the psychological testing came back. The diagnosis was devastating: paranoid schizophrenia. The doctors argued that Isabella wasn't a Black Widow in the traditional sense, someone who kills for gain or spite. Instead, she was a girl who believed she was saving the world from a monster. In her fractured mind, the woman in the bathroom wasn't Yunmi, she was a demon that needed to be exorcised. This revelation threw the prosecution into a tailspin. How do you try a girl for 79 stabs when she claims she was fighting a war against the supernatural? Yet the mask remained. Even as her defense team prepared for an insanity plea, Isabella continued to perform. She was hyper-aware of the presence of others. When she knew she was being watched, she would adjust her posture, tilt her head, and offer that chilling, doll-like stare. It was as if she were a character in a movie that only she was watching. The exposure of her mental illness didn't make her less terrifying to the public. It made her more so. It suggested that behind her beautiful face, there was an absolute void where a conscience should be. The investigation also looked into her childhood, searching for the trauma that triggers such a violent break. They found a girl who had struggled with her identity, a girl who felt caught between the traditional Korean values of her mother and the fast-paced, individualistic culture of American youth. But thousands of teenagers feel that way. Very few of them pick up a knife. The mistakes she made were human, but the motive remained elusive. Was it the disease, or was the disease a convenient shield for a girl who simply wanted her way? By the time the trial date approached, the evidence was a mountain of contradictions. You had the cold, hard facts, the email, the knife, the 79 wounds, and you had the clinical assessments, the delusions, the voices, the fractured psyche. The exposure of Isabella Guzman was the exposure of a tragedy with no easy villains. If she was a monster, she was a monster born of biological misfortune. If she was a killer, she was the most cold-blooded teenager Colorado had ever seen. As the legal teams prepared their opening statements, the girl in the cell continued to fix her hair in the reflection of the stainless steel toilet. She was ready for her audience. The investigation was over, the forensic maps were drawn, and the truth, whatever version of it Isabella chose to believe, was about to be broadcast to the world. The girl who would pay her mother back in blood was about to become a household name, proving that sometimes the most terrifying thing a detective can expose is the fact that we can never truly know what is happening behind a beautiful pair of eyes. The courtroom of the 18th Judicial District in Centennial, Colorado, is a place of sterile, hushed formality, designed to strip away the sensationalism of the outside world. But in late 2013, it became the stage for a performance that would eventually burn through the internet like a wildfire. This was the climax of a domestic horror story, the moment when the town of Aurora, and eventually the world, would look into the eyes of Isabella Guzman and try to find a trace of a soul. Isabella did not enter the courtroom like a typical defendant. There was no bowed head, no tearful glances toward her surviving family. Instead, as the cameras from the local news pool began to whir, Isabella found her lens. She didn't just look at the cameras, she played to them. She tilted her head with a coy, doll-like curiosity. She puffed out her cheeks, made playful fish faces, and used her shackled hands to push back strands of hair with the grace of a debutante. The disconnect was jarring. On the monitors in the courtroom, the prosecution was preparing to show the visceral reality of what had happened in that bathroom. The 79 wounds, the blood-soaked carpet, the "you will pay" email. And in the center of it all sat the girl who had done it, smirking as if she were in on a private joke that the rest of the room was too dull to understand. It was this footage, years later, that would find a second life on TikTok and YouTube, set to haunting music, turning a matricide into a vibe for a generation of viewers who saw only the mask and not the carnage. The trial was not a question of did she do it. The evidence was an avalanche. Instead, the climax of the legal battle focused on the thin, gray line between evil and illness. The prosecution argued that the 79 stabs were the result of a simmering, narcissistic rage, the Black Widow instinct to eliminate an obstacle. They pointed to the email as proof of a cold-blooded plan. But the defense brought forth a series of experts who painted a picture of a mind that had completely untethered from reality. The court heard testimony about Isabella's behavior in the days leading up to the attack. She had been seen staring at walls, claiming that the woman she was living with was a biological imposter. The diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia was not just a legal strategy. It was supported by state-appointed doctors who found that Isabella was suffering from severe delusions. In her mind, she wasn't killing her mother. She was fighting a war against a creature that had replaced her mother. The climax of the proceedings came when the judge delivered the verdict. Based on the overwhelming psychological evidence, Isabella Guzman was found not guilty by reason of insanity. In the eyes of the law, she was not a criminal to be punished, but a patient to be treated. She was sentenced to be committed to the Colorado Mental Health Institute at Pueblo for an indefinite period, not for a term of years, but until the state deemed her no longer a threat to society. The public reaction was a mix of shock and fury. For many, the image of her smirking in court was proof enough of her evil. They saw a girl who had manipulated the system, a femme fatale, who had used her youth and beauty to escape the cage. But for those who understood the science of the mind, the verdict was a somber acknowledgement of a tragedy that had no winners. As she was led out of the courtroom, Isabella offered one last look at the cameras, a look that was neither remorseful nor defiant. It was simply empty. The trial had provided a conclusion, but not a resolution. The girl with the viral smile was gone, replaced by a permanent resident of a high-security psychiatric facility. The legal system had spoken, but the question of what truly lived behind that smile remained unanswered, hanging in the air of the courtroom long after the doors were locked. Today, Isabella Guzman remains behind the high walls of the Colorado Mental Health Institute, but the story didn't end with her commitment. In a digital twist of fate, her 2013 courtroom footage exploded into a viral phenomenon in 2020, garnering millions of views from a generation captivated by her eerie charm. To some, she is a misunderstood victim of her own mind. To others, she is the ultimate Black Widow who successfully wore a mask of madness to escape a life sentence. Isabella herself has recently sought release, claiming that medication has finally silenced the voices and cured the monster. But as she fights for her freedom, the haunting question remains. In a world where we only see what the lens captures, can you ever truly trust a recovered killer? Or is the smile she wears today just another layer of the mask she perfected 79 stabs ago? We are left to wonder if the girl who conquered TikTok is a tragedy of science or a triumph of cold, calculated deception. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below.